Okay, so we're hitting up the last sprint in this phase, and that means taking all your divergent concepts at a high level and converging them. In your sprint presentation, some of you mentioned that users even mentioned that they'd like to see functionality combined. All your teams have identified ideas and features that you'd like to converge into one final vision for what could help serve your user to accomplish their goals. One team talked about, are we innovative enough and how can we really produce something of value in the amount of time that we have? And so it's not just about converging your ideas, because you could converge all of them together into this monstrosity. There's actually a monstrosity slide that I'm really happy to show you. But that really wouldn't serve your users. And you have a vision maybe for what ultimately you could do if you had all the time, all the money, but you don't have all the time. You only have like a week. So that's where the concept of an MVP, or a minimum viable product, comes in. And I have fleshed out this deck to more detailed explanation of what an MVP is. And so the whole idea is, if you only have a short period of time, how can you be sure that you're going to make the best impact, the biggest impact, and be proud of your work and make an impact in the world? And MVP is a term you're going to hear throughout your career. It's a term that's misunderstood, and I'm going to help you understand it in like 5 or 6 different ways, because not every way makes sense to everyone. And to be honest, it took me 5 or 6 different ways to get it. So I think this is really important, and it's about the discipline that you can have about being strategic, of saying no, so that what you say yes to, you can polish and hone and will actually be useful and used. So a little bit of context setting is, you were in the problem space and you're now in the solution space, that second diamond, and you just finished exploring being divergent, that blue diamond. So you're probably now, and actually are now, into this defined. So you're converging in the solution space. And so you've done 2 rounds of concept testing already, and then you've synthesized this data. You have a plan, a vision, you have instincts and gut feelings about what you want, and you've done prioritization and voting exercises, and you might have a general idea where you're going, and this lecture is going to help you create that one converged solution. So to kind of zoom out and take a step back, at the top we have what I've been hounding you guys on in the problem space, is the personas, and I would argue adding the journey map of what the persona's going through. And bridging the 2 diamonds, you have your design principles, and the whole project is based on the problem statement that some of you had to iterate on, because once you got feedback from various instructors, it was too general, or you realized you didn't have enough nuance or meat from your research to really solve a problem for a defined user. And so we've gotten to a point where that's all really strong at the top, and that is the foundation for the solution space. So in sprint 3, you already did this, concept and usability testing scripts. So sometimes there's a hybrid, a little bit of usability testing in there, but mostly it's, do the concepts resonate with people? And you had all these individual prototypes, and I would say mostly they're just concepts. And so once you get into actually a prototype, a converged prototype, you're going to have a usability test. So you're taking the generic concept, you're converging all of the generic concepts, and by generic I just mean high level. And once you can flesh it out in a step-by-step, state-by-state, and you have an overarching goal that's subdivided into tasks that are going in a piecemeal fashion, that level of fidelity, not resolution of visuals, but fidelity of functionality, once you have that built in, you can do full usability tests. So really, the concept testing is, did we make the right thing? And usability is, did we make it the right way? And then the proposed MVP is a incomplete core set of functionality that serves the main user pain points and underserved needs. And going back to the conversation of like, what can you do in a week or a sprint, you have your proposed MVP, but you might have feature recommendations. Those feature recommendations can be as simple as a prioritized list or as complicated as a roadmap. So given how long it took you to get to this point, how long would it take you to add another feature? You can estimate that. Which feature should be the next feature? We don't really go into road mapping, and that's kind of in product strategy and product management. But if you can't produce an MVP that shows your vision, you can either go back to concepts from Sprint 3 and maybe create a concept of your future state, make that potentially at a simple level, a prioritized list, some kind of concrete manifestation of that, so that I, as a stakeholder in that dual role that I'm playing in this phase, can say, hey, I understand what you're going for, and we're going to use this MVP today to help your persona tomorrow. Because if we wait to the vision, nobody's going to get served, and maybe it's the wrong thing, because the MVP will help you learn if you're actually producing value, which we'll get to in a little bit. So the way I think about it, and this is not the best data visualization, it's a little noisy and it's going to get noisier, but it's a quick and dirty take of what you have done in a different way. So I'm zooming out again to kind of give you a sense of the importance of this moment of the prototype. So we're going to start with the why. So like, why are we doing this project, the project brief, and who are we doing it for? And you're going like, how are we gonna do it, general concepts, and like the what is, how do we execute that plan? So you're going from your vision, so what's the ultimate goal, to the strategy, like what are we gonna do and what are we not gonna do? And then the product is like, now that we know what we're gonna do, let's execute on that. So how does that link to what you just did? So design principles kind of help you determine like your vision. It should do these things. They're very high level. And then linking the vision to strategy are the concepts. The concepts are based on the design principles. And then the concepts bridge to your prototype. And then finally, your prototype can go to your MVP. Technically speaking, a prototype is something that isn't functional. It might appear to be functional. And technically speaking, an MVP is functional, although there are many different types of MVPs, which I get to in the extra resources. But it's something that would actually produce value and live in the real world. Whereas a prototype may seem to produce value, but isn't living in the real world. It's more of an artificial testing environment. So really, we're helping you build up the pyramid, and anytime you learn something that invalidates an action, decision, hypothesis, assumption, you're gonna go back down, iterate, go back up. And so it's always good to have those fast, rapid iterations so that you're doing the right thing for the right people, for the right problem. And that's really what building an MVP is all about, and converging your concepts. So your divergent concepts will be used to create that converged concept and eventually your MVP. So when you, and some of you are already decided or further along on which are the ones that should like quote unquote win, or the ones that are the ones you'll go forward with. So adherence to design principles. Ways to prioritize that is if you have 3 design principles, each idea gets scored on some kind of scale. You can do voting on that. How well it solved for the problem statement, there could be a way to quantify that and vote on that as a group. Viability according to the business constraints. So we don't have a real client, but considering the government and what we know about Chicago and the issues that they have and have had with budgeting, you can imagine that there's a lot of constraints. So some ideas might be better solutions for the user, but more ambitious on the constraints. And so it's your responsibility as a designer to balance the needs of the user with the constraints that you have, So you can score that on some level. And then trending user data, meaning the user's desires and that have been voiced to you. And so all of these can be scored and all of these can be weighted. So let's say you want to be really practical and not so blue sky. Maybe constraints in the business, maybe those get weighted, those scores. You still score them, but they're worth twice as much. Just throwing that out there. There's no wrong or right way to do this other than you agree as a group what your priorities are and that you have a way to articulate them in a time-boxed fashion to make an informed decision that you can back up and explain rationally and persuade your stakeholder that we really considered all of these things and we try to be objective as possible, and this is all us kind of guessing in a way, because you don't really know how much something's going to cost, how much something's going to, how long things are going to take, how well it will actually solve. So you're taking your best guess as a group, and the hive mind, the collective knowledge of your team, you have to trust in that, and you're on the same page, pretty much. So your converged prototype or minimum viable product is incomplete. And I'll get to what that means in a moment. So we have the user journey, and there's pain points along the way. If you had all the time and money in the world, you could iterate and make something, a solution that solves for all of that, but you're only gonna solve for part of their journey, and you may not fully solve their problem, you may reduce the pain points. Ideally, you would reduce the pain points entirely, but the whole point is that you can't do everything, so be strategic and what are you not doing so that you can focus on what you are doing. And so it is a collection of features and user flows. Let me just turn on Do Not Disturb here. It is a collection of features and possible user flows that have consistently tested well. And of course, just all the design concepts that have gotten this far should adhere to design principles. So of course the ones that converge would as well. And then you're considering all of the variables. So I hate it when there's like marketing speak at keynotes, especially like I think Microsoft when they released the service, they're like, this is a no compromise design. Actually, design is literally about compromises. It's balancing constraints. It's dealing with constraints. And there's a lecture in the next phase about constraints and adapting to them. So you have to make trade-offs. The idea is that each concept has its own pros and its own cons, and by combining them together, you take the best of all of them, negating the weaknesses. So it should be, and I'm highlighting this, an incomplete minimum viable product. So you're not doing the whole end-to-end experience. You're taking the highlight of the journey and showing me, like, you can use storytelling to show me the before and the after, but you're showing me not a complete product that you can take out, download, and use with complete onboarding and everything, but like, what's the main thing that matters to the user and the main benefit you're providing, and like polish that to shine and glimmer to the point where I need sunglasses. And you can't do that if you try to do the whole thing. So it's really about discipline there. So it should not be everything put together, complete and comprehensive, and nothing should be new and untested. As your stakeholder, I'm going to be the most critical of your final prototype because everything else I could have taken with a grain of salt because I haven't seen how it's going to manifest itself. So really, you got to do everything you can to say, to anticipate if your stakeholder is going to push back and push holes. We tested it. It's not like we as a team just want something. It's rooted in research, data, feedback, that kind of thing. So how do you do that at a practical level? So here's how I think of it. You have a bunch of ideas, and then one idea in the middle, the red one, clearly didn't work in testing. So that's like folding, or like in cards, you're just like out. And then one idea, the top one, kind of worked, and you pivoted it. And then the last idea at the bottom, it worked really well, and you doubled down. And potentially the two blue ones could be merged together into your converged prototype. And another way to think about it is many of you tested 4 concepts out of your divergent set of a larger number, you got to 4. This is an example with 3. So let's say you have 3, and you had your test plan to get feedback at a concept testing, potentially hybrid concept usability testing. And you use that test plan to get feedback, to rank, to score, to validate and invalidate these concepts. And you get insights. This worked, this didn't. Not just what worked and what didn't, but why. Following up why, because why is going to help you understand how to pivot. Why is going to help you move forward when you know things aren't working. It'll help you figure out what to do to make things work. And then your insights might say that prototype 2 was the strongest, prototype 3 was a dud, and prototype 1 was second strongest. And you can see that Venn diagram overlap. There is a part of prototype 1 that could be used to augment and enhance prototype 2, but really prototype 2 is the foundation, and we're sprinkling on prototype 1. You want to do it in a way that seems organic, that is organic actually, and that makes sense logically. And it may not be literally a feature ripped from 1 and put into 2. It could be something that's like a slight modification, or it's the like spirit of the feature. And so, yes, you didn't technically test it, but like you can't take something like prototype 1, which existed in its own context, and put it into a new context and keep it exactly the same. Be like creating a Frankenstein. So we want to avoid a Frankenstein. We want to help merge the two. And instead of Frankenstein, we want to merge with DNA so they become a new creature. And I have evolution as a metaphor for MVPs, which I think will help actually, which I am excited to share with you. And then, so now we have this converged prototype, and prototype 1 was part of it. And you have a usability test plan to go forward with that. And the usability test plan, you test the converged prototype with that part of the other concept, and you get insights from that. And then you don't have time necessarily to iterate again, but you can tell your stakeholder what you would iterate on if you had time. You can also then say, based on our insights, here's our vision, here's our prioritized features. Sometimes you can have not prioritized features, because features are solutions, but you might, in an affinity diagram, have themes. Well, you can have themes and next steps. So our theme is we want to focus on social things. We want to focus on time, and you might be able to not get into that solutioning just yet. Often in road mapping and creating features in the future over time, which is more product management and strategy, usually each quarter, year release has like a theme, and themes relate to pain points and goals of users. So you can think about it that way. So that's all the baked in official Flatiron stuff, and now I'm gonna get into the MVP, because I think MVP is like still pretty vague. And the more concrete I can make it for you, the less arguments you guys are gonna have. You'll have constructive disagreements instead, and you'll kind of know how to navigate this part of the design process. Because when you're getting user feedback in the solution space, often users are gonna tell you, I want this, I want that. Users are typically not designers, and if you're not listening to the why behind that, you can easily get your compass misaligned and not really have a sense of where to go. So here's kind of how I think about it. So this is the best definition I could find. A minimum viable product, also known MVP, the smallest thing you can build that delivers customer value. So the emphasis here is smallest thing and customer value. Ash Mayora, who created the Lean Stack company, it's a company that merges design thinking, lean UX, and agile. He does the best job of explaining MVPs, and he kind of adds a little bit to it. So he kind of goes into, it's the smallest thing you can build to determine if it is actually valuable, and the smallest thing that you can build to determine the most valuable thing. and he actually adds a minimum viable product needs to capture that value. So I know there's like a typo there, but he goes into capturing value. So like, how do you actually know if what you're doing is valuable? Well, if you produce something that's real, an MVP, it lives in the real world, you know it's valuable if people use it. You know it's valuable if people offer their time or money in order to use it. So people can say in your usability and desirability testing, like, oh, I would use that. That's a good indicator, but what people say and what people do are often very different. And so the proof that you have something that's actually viable is that people are willing to give you money. And that just proves that it's valuable enough that it warrants existing, because it's not, in the business sense, it's not even viable, because if you're producing something that some people might use, but nobody's gonna pay for it, how are you gonna get paid to continue making and maintaining it? And so really what you're trying to do is you're making an assumption. You put something out in the world, you would think, based on all of your hard work over these past couple sprints, that it's gonna produce value, but if people don't use it and people don't think it's worth buying, or if it's not a business to consumer model, maybe it's being funded by a grant, or maybe it's publicly funded. If the government's not willing to do that, it's not really viable either. So there's viable in the business sense, can you do it and be sustainable by being paid? Or there's viable meaning, is it gonna help the user by providing value? So it's often misunderstood, so let's explore this concept further. So we're going in clockwise fashion. This is Spotify. How many people here have a Spotify account currently? If you could raise your hands. Okay, so this is how Spotify came to be. So we start with the vision. This is literally a sketch that people at the Spotify team made, where we have all of these different features and sidebars, and it's a concept. It's very high level, not dissimilar to what you guys did, but it's packed with a lot of things. Too many things. So the team built an MVP, which I'll get into what that is like made of and what defined the MVP. And they went through this iterative loop, which comes from the discipline of lean UX, which starts with declare assumptions. So you're kind of through research, through analysis, through synthesis, through just brain dumping what you already think, you're declaring your assumptions. And as a designer, you're kind of a scientist, and you have to invalidate or validate those assumptions. And the only way you can do that is by creating an MVP to run an experiment where the MVP gets exposed to users. And what's the feedback that you get? You get feedback, and then you declare your assumptions again. It's a loop where, as a designer, you're acting as a scientist, doing experiments to learn, does my MVP create value? And if so, double down. If not, pivot or switch entirely. Then, through iterations, the MVP becomes the first version of the product, and it gets iterated on. So version 1.0 could be a beta version, could be version whatever. And so this is the vision and concept from the previous slide in the upper left. So it has all the bells and whistles. It's an ideal future state. It's many releases down the road. And it's what could be made if all the assumptions were correct. And so you can think of each pane and each bar and each component as its own assumption. Like, this works, this user wants this, and all the flows would get complicated. You know, we've got playlists, we've got sharing, we've got, AI predicting what people want to listen to. There's like all of this stuff, and many of it is there now. But at the time, before streaming was mainstream, who knew what would work? There were models from iTunes and downloading that worked, but Spotify didn't have that. So what they kind of did was they were like, let's cut out all the stuff that's not the core. What is Spotify? At the end of the day, press play a song from the cloud. And they turned it into their MVP, which is a blurry screenshot. It's like the highest resolution I could find. But the MVP, it's even more blurry. Okay, so it's basically it was hard coded with a set of songs in the cloud, and they showed it to friends and family, and they were like, what do you think? Do you like this? How's it going? The people that made this had hard coded songs in the cloud, and they walked around. It wasn't even a mobile app at this point. It was on a desktop. They'd like walk around and like see if they liked the experience, and then they would go use iTunes and like compare it and take notes and like comes up for them. And it was like this thing that allowed them to figure out if it worked. So they didn't have a wider audience. They didn't have a business model, and it was their skateboard. And the skateboard is a metaphor that I'll get into. So their Spotify was their skateboard. So what did they actually do? If we've zoomed in to so far it's blurry, into the pixels. We're gonna zoom out. What did they actually do? So Spotify created a MVP, and that was in order to determine problem-solution fit. So we talked about problem space, we talked about solution space. We have the two diamonds from the design process. So an MVP allows you to determine whether you actually have a problem-solution fit. When you find a problem that's worth solving for a user that knows they have the problem and is hurt, has a pain in their life, they're willing to provide you value, money, time, to get value in return. Your MVP's unique value proposition, the main thing that it does. Once you identify the problem-solution fit, you're basically, for the target customer, your solution serves their underserved needs. If you go farther down your timeline in the design process, there's this concept called product market fit, which is if you can solve for a few users here and there, can you solve for enough users in a big enough market where you can actually make a business, a company, and be viable and sustainable? And so all of this happens going from research to analysis, synthesis, to concepts, to prototype, MVP, to actually having a version that works and lives in the world. That is how Spotify did it. That's kind of how you'll do it. You're not going to get to product market fit because you're not creating your own company as a startup. But you can't get to product market fit at scale unless you have problem solution fit. So in a way, product market fit is problem solution fit, but just bigger. But you start small and you build off something that's successful and you add on to it, kind of like a snowball of sorts, which is another metaphor that I added on without even knowing it. So there we go. So Facebook, back when it was called the Facebook, what was their minimum viable product? You could only interact with college students at select Ivy League schools. There was no timeline. There were pokes, and I think there were thumbs up. So you could basically have a profile, and you could see who was in your classes. And those were the good old days before the Russians got involved. But basically, it was a very small target audience with a very particular unmet need, underserved need. And now, my grandfather, he's 94, actually just turned 95 actually. Ooh. He's like, hey, can you teach me how to use Facebook? And I was like thinking, Facebook does like a billion things. Like what he wants is the core feature set of like messaging me and like liking my photos, and then inappropriately, because he doesn't know social media etiquette, engaging with me in a way that makes sense. So like kind of my grandfather wants that core feature set that Facebook started with, which is like, who are people that I already know, and can I be in touch with them and know a little bit about them? And now Facebook is this huge sprawling thing with marketplace, and they bought Oculus and VR. Like, we're way past the minimum viable product of Facebook. But at F8, which I always want to call Fate, the developer conference for Facebook, basically they went through their feature set, roadmap if you will, and they didn't even have photos at the very beginning. I think it was just text, or you could have a profile photo but you couldn't upload or whatever. And the real-time streaming didn't happen until like 2008, 2009. I mean, things we take for granted, like a like button, like they were really prioritizing the things that mattered. And I mean, newsfeed is arguably the thing that made them into a more scalable business model. But I mean, if you join Facebook later on, you assume they've always had these things, but it was very incremental, very piecemeal. And building in smaller chunks is a more agile way of working, and that's how MVPs kind of work. And so you can see Facebook started around 2004, and they didn't gain popularity. So in the beginning, they were looking for problem, solution, fit, and then there's product, market, fit as they scale. And this is how they worked. I mean, okay, show of hands again. How many people have an Amazon Prime account? I do too. So I love me some Amazon. They're not perfect, but you know, they're great. They started just with books. They got online at the right time, and they operationalized better than almost any company on the face of the planet. But they started with a website that really wasn't designed well at all. At the time, I don't even know if CSS was like a thing, but their minimum viable product was, we sell online books. And probably within that, you can scope it down even further. Like you could maybe only, buy books with a certain standard shipping rate, and there wasn't Prime, so you couldn't like have options. So maybe everything was standard shipping, whatever it is. Like think of all the things that you take for granted in Amazon, strip it down, take away the choices, do one thing. There's that. This is a real example from the Swedish police, and you can think of each number as a version, and you can think of the whole shape as like a screen, and so to speak. So you can think of the X or the Y-axis as crime types. So basically this whole software was basically like, how does the Swedish police visualize, track crime over the entire country, given that there's different regions, and how are there dashboards that have like indicators of how things are going. So the way that they did it, they didn't build out everything together, but if you think of the the Y-axis as crime types, and the X-axis as the region, they picked one region and one crime type to start off. Is it the right thing to do? Does it work? Do the police like it? Does it have an impact on the things they're measuring? So they're measuring the things that matter in their company, in their organization. How many crimes are they stopping? How much time is spent on paperwork? Whatever it is, cross-departmental communication. They're like measuring those things before. They produce version 1.0, one crime type, one region. Does it move the needle? Oh, move the needle in the good direction. Let's add a crime type, but keep the region. Cool. Let's make a bigger crime type that's more ambitious or vague or something. Okay, now not until version 1.3 do we add another region, because we have validation over time that it worked. Over time, it builds out. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but Mark Lebowski, but Mark, he talks about design mobile first. And basically, if you can get the core feature set, the screen on a mobile device, it forces you to basically say no to a lot of things. Because if you have a desktop that's huge, you can put in 1 million buttons. But having a mobile first version of your app actually forces you to create an MVP, because you can't have every feature on that small of a screen. So this is how the the Swedish police did it. And so so there's that. If we have time, I created a dating app that didn't go anywhere because I didn't know what I was doing, but I was really ambitious and excited. I didn't know about MVPs, and I just learned about them, and I had them wrong. And if we have time, because I want to be respectful of your time, I have a really quick case study, and another time I have a whole story about my life at that time. I think it's a good anecdote. So if we have time, MVP metaphors. So I gave you some examples, right? So we got a pocket knife, cuts fat, evolution, car, skateboard, pyramid versus pyramid, cake versus cupcake, Mona Lisa. So I think there's a little bit of things out of order here, but I'm basically just gonna give you a rapid fire, think of it this way, think of it this way, and go back to this deck at some point and pick one that works for you, and you can use this to explain to stakeholders, because this is really a tough concept and that kind of thing. So I apologize if they're out of order. I made some last minute edits this morning, so I was like, I don't know if the flow's working. But so here's your vision. Here's what you want to create in the world. And here's what you have time for. Like 1 or 2 knives. And maybe, like, think about survival, like in the woods. Like, pick your use case, pick your persona. The first-time camper needs a tool to help their first-time camping. Well, like, they don't, that's a problem statement, okay? Well, do they need a magnifying glass? Like, probably not. Like, what do they need? They probably need a saw, and they, like, might need a can opener. Like, great, first version, great. And then after they get more advanced user, they can upgrade, and, like, as you get more time, let's say you're the Swiss Army and you've created a knife that does 2 things. It's better than, it's like warrants existing because it's not a regular knife. It's done 2 things. That's the MVP. And then this is the final thing. But most designers early in the career are like, everything is great. We can't say no. Look at that thing. And like, it's like I don't know what these 3 do. I don't know. I like cleaned my fingernails with them once, but that's probably not what they're for. But like, it's a corkscrew. Are you really drinking wine and camping? Yes, you are. But do you need to do that? No. So what's the core? Speaking of that, like, cut the fat. So, like, fat makes meat taste great. Makes everything taste great. But if you have too much fat and not enough meat, it's not healthy. And if you have only fat, it's not really a meal. It's really just you killing yourself slowly. But essentially, have a discussion. What is meat and what is fat? What is the bells and whistles? What is the things that are nice to have, and what is the meat that like you need to have? Okay, next is a metaphor of evolution. I haven't yet seen this metaphor. I'm sure it exists and people have talked about it, but I've tried to articulate this well. So this is going to be a little interactive for you guys. So on each slide, there'll be an image and some long text. 1 person per slide, and don't repeat, please. Just whoever wants to popcorn will read what's on the slide. And then you'll tell me after the lecture if this metaphor even works. I think it works. We'll see. This is an MVP of explaining an MVP. It's the smallest thing I can build to help you guys produce value. I get feedback, I iterate, next lecture, the next cohort gets a better version. So meta, love meta. Okay. Somebody read this.
A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be patched up to make it work. You have to start over, beginning with a working simple system. John.
So we exist today in the upper right because nature, evolution, created an MVP, a single freaking cell, and through trial and error became us. Who knew that, if you believe in God or not, but nature did this. We're basically copying from them. So there we go. So there's the MVP. So somebody read this.
Don't design the mammal in your first pass, it will die. Create the building blocks that will become the mammal in time. The users and market, nature, natural selection, will decide what works and what doesn't, and the validated learning from what didn't work will result in a mammal that thrives, which will be an evolution. Read the rest?
Yeah.
Pick the right slide. Ideas. Text on sticky note, 1 cell. Concepts with statement, 1 cell organisms. Converted prototype MVP, multicellular organism. High fidelity and or high resolution. Code in the real world after the program. Beta, pilot test, working MVP, fish to reptile, version 1.0 simple mammal.
So after the program, meaning like when you have a job and things actually get produced. And so you can imagine in that family tree of how all organisms are related to each other that things die off. And it's not about the strongest, it's not about the fastest, it's about the ones that can adapt. And when you create small things, when they die off, you don't waste a lot of time and energy, so you can be adaptable, your ideas can be adaptable, and your ideas can evolve. And when your creations die off, some of the DNA might be warrant saving. So it might be that the fish died, but it lived a long time in the environment, but the environment shifted, but actually its tough scales still work. It was just its gills weren't really working. And so if you know why things fail, you can help your idea's DNA continue. And speaking of DNA, just read validated learning. Someone else?
Validated learning. It's not about the survival of the animal. It's about the survival of the DNA to produce organisms that are able to adapt and thrive in the real world. Create your creatures, see what survives, combine what does, let the weak die off.
So we have all these crazy creatures. Like, why does a giraffe have such a long neck? That's funny looking. The lobster here's crazy colors. Interesting choice. This I forget what it was called, but it's tardigrade. Yeah, it's like the most durable animal in all of existence, and it's is it called like a water cow or something?
Water cows,
Yeah, it's like, that's nuts, and they survive in space and no oxygen. I don't know, it's crazy. And this is a man of war. It's like one of the more deadly organisms that's like thousands of organisms combined. Like, if you were chosen to design a new animal, like, would you come up with these things? Probably not. So all these organisms are the result of natural selection and thrived in the constraints in their niche, just like in the constraints in your project. For each niche in an ecosystem, there are many correct answers, not just a single one right answer. There are lots of wrong answers, however. So you're letting the testing of your MVP dictate what evolves and thrives, and it's not like my idea is good because I made it. It's that I hope to help the user, and if it doesn't help them, then my ego's out of the way, and let's move on to something else that can serve the user. If you don't do an MVP and you try to design the mammal in the first pass, this is kind of like a trope from sci-fi, where it's kind of like, every moment is agony, kill me. Like, it's not adapted to the existence that it's in, and it's just kind of an abomination that's not helping anyone and is in pain. And we could watch this forever because it's a loop and it's pretty awesome. So that's my kind of take on it. Another way to think about it is the traditional way to build something is you create a vision, number 4 at the top. Let's design a car, pretend cars don't exist yet, and then before Henry Ford and all that stuff. And well, how would you go about building it? The old way is like we first build a wheel and then we add the base or whatever that's called in automotive. It's going to connect the wheels, and then you have the chassis. So we have all these sad faces. The user does not get value until the end. But because we're going back in time and imagining that cars don't exist yet, maybe a car wasn't the right thing. Obviously, we now know a car is a great invention. It causes problems. It's not perfect. But how else could they build a car? Well, if we abstract the problem that a car is trying to solve, which is merely transportation, making it better than walking, how can we help your persona today? The smallest thing that you can build to produce value. Help them today. Well, you can produce a skateboard and then learn that it's really hard to balance on. Validated learning, but you provided value. Then we have scooters. Really easy to balance on, but hard to go up hills, and potholes are a mess. So let's create a bike. Bikes are great, but can't go long distances. Let's build a motorcycle, learn about combustion engines, iterate on that, wheel trains, all these terms and automotive stuff I don't know. But you imagine things evolve. Then we go from 2 wheels to 4, we produce a car. Meanwhile, A, you've been producing user value along the way. B, you've been validated your learning, and actually, now you have a company that sells 5 different products. Oh my goodness, so much better when you do the MVP. I was taught design in the above model, which is called the waterfall model, and I still strive to be more agile and build MVPs, and it's something that comes in time, and it's not instinctual to some. I would argue most. So how not to do an MVP? is here's a hierarchy, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or Maslow's hierarchy of needs from psychology. So in order to make a product, you have to be functional first, then reliable, usable, convenient, pleasurable, meaningful. You can argue about whether these are the right terms, but essentially there's a hierarchy of needs and aspirational goals. You can't just create something that's functional and it doesn't produce all of these other things. It's not polished to the point where it gleams, to the point where I need sunglasses. The way you get to the MVP is you take a small slice of all the functionality, an incomplete slice, and that slice is functional, reliable, usable, convenient, pleasurable, and meaningful, polished. So you're taking a slice. So you're doing less over time from your user journey. You're doing more because you have that vertical space to play with on the pyramid. So another way to think about it is making a wedding cake. So my mom does wedding planning, and I've officiated weddings, so I'm familiar with all of the drama that can create. There's the show Bridezilla of all the indecision and drama that comes from things. Well, the old way, the non-MVP way, is you have these tastings and you make entire cakes, and there's options, and you look at how they look visually. So you create a cake base, you create a cake filling, you create icing, and well, that takes a while. Let's say that you've taken all this time to build a cake and the bride or groom doesn't like it. You have to go back and build another cake. So instead of that, what if you had made 15 different kinds of cupcakes with 15 different recipes, really small things that produce value and you can get validated. And then once you we created 15 cupcakes, 3 were chosen, let's create 3 cakes, or maybe 1 flavor, 3 different visual styles, that gets chosen, you make the wedding cake. So you're less likely to get pushback from your stakeholders later on in the game because you've gotten to the core of what the user cares about, the texture, the color, the presentation, whatever it is. So here's all the complexity that would go into being potentially wasted at a cake level. But really, it's how long does it take to come up with this idea and actually make it versus you know what, we're not even gonna make a cupcake. We're gonna make cupcakes and we're gonna cut them up and then we're gonna have mix and match. And how long would it take to create this menu and palette and have tastings of combining different things before making the final product? This is your way to get to the wedding cake, which is the final product, using MVPs. The smallest thing to create value, what's value? The bride and groom get to make a decision on what they like and don't like. Oh, I like lemon, but the way you make lemon, I don't like. Let's eliminate that. All you've done is made an ounce or 2 of that. You haven't wasted time. You haven't wasted money. Another metaphor, Mona Lisa. So traditionally, non-MVP world, a person comes up with an idea of, I want to make the Mona Lisa, and you're stuck with your vision, and you build it piece by piece. If you ever get pushback by a stakeholder at some point about it being the wrong thing to make, you have to change your entire vision, you've wasted your time. Versus a concept statement, hey stakeholder, I'd like to make a woman in a pastoral setting. Oh, stakeholder says yes, let's do that. Okay, I'm gonna draw this with pencil, it takes an hour or 2. Hey stakeholder, do you like this? Hey user, do you like this? Okay, great. Now let me rough it up. Oh, the warm earth tones and stuff. Stakeholder, do you like this? Users, do you like this? Now let's use paints, full scale, let's make it. At any point, this could have been scrapped, but only an hour or 2 is wasted. And then by the time Mona Lisa comes along, it's let's add that flourish and polish because we've had time to get the big core assumptions. Let's add a very ambiguous smile. And that was the key to making Mona Lisa, reducing risk and reducing pushback along the way, which is what an MVP allows you to do.
This is exactly the way they teach you to paint in art school, probably. If you do the top one, it looks uncanny and bad, it takes forever. If you do the bottom one, it takes 3 hours.
Yeah, so there is an overlap with art and design, and if that resonates with you and your experience, great. Hopefully these will hit different boxes and hit different buttons. But yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, totally. So You know, your instinct might be to do this, but no, be self-aware. That's what you're doing, and stop. Do something else. So creating MVPs, how do you do that? This is a technique known as user story mapping, which we don't teach here, and just kind of explaining as a way to visualize things. So if a user journey has different activities that they do over time with those purple stickies or maroon, then your MVP, you might identify that certain things in the beginning, two in the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end, represent the biggest pain points. And an MVP has to be solving user need, but not all of them. And so it's kind of the core tasks essential to completing the main journey. So version 1 might fill in the gaps where the MVP didn't. Version 2 might continue that trend, and then over time, you're filling in all the features of the yellow stickies with the tasks that are the maroon stickies at the bottom. So how people do that is having it on a wall, and then each row, so we have MVP 1.0, 2.0, each row is called a slice, and each slice has a theme. So this theme is about getting to the core of what is there. Now that the core has been solved, we've validated it, let's add some additional functionality. So I've mentioned this a couple of times. Design thinking is exploring the problem. Lean design is building the right things, and arguably could also be design thinking. And then agile is building the thing right. And your MVP is kind of going into the solution space. And when we talk about design thinking, when we talk about lean, when we talk about agile, it's different than waterfall design. In your professional lives, you're going to work at places that are either agile, or they're going to be waterfall, or they're going to be hybrid. And a form of agile is called Scrum. It's not the only form of agile, but basically waterfall, or the non-MVP version, is when you can basically, there's waterfall, there's agile, two approaches. You can do or, choose one, or and a hybrid, okay? So waterfall is when scope is fixed and then resources and time are estimated. Often in agile, your resources and time are fixed, like in this program, and your scope is estimated. We talked about problem framing, problem scoping, project scoping, that kind of stuff. So you can use this model to decide what approach to use. Most of the time you want to use, in software, an agile approach. Waterfall is really good for really complex interdependent systems and things with long release cycles. Things like battleships and skyscrapers are physical objects, lots of dependencies. Notice that the scope is fixed. They know what they're going to make. A good case study for when Agile and Waterfall weren't used properly is in healthcare.gov. So I encourage you guys to look that up. And one of the reasons that they worked in an Agile way, which is how most software is made these days, if in the best case, but they maybe should have used a waterfall approach because scope was very fixed. So in Waterfall, you get requirements, you do analysis, you design, you code, you test, and it's very linear. And that worked well when like things were on CD-ROM and you release things once a year. But because we want to be iterative, because software is as a service, you can download it, you can update it, it's cheap to change code now. You didn't need to create physical objects. You can go through this lean loop of iteration, come up with ideas, build an MVP or prototype that turns into something that lives in the real world, a product. You measure how it's used, you get data, you learn from it, you repeat. So if the Encarta 95 CD-ROM was waterfall, and we want to be lean, what represents something today that utilizes the agile, like iterative, is the Google Assistant. It always gets new services, better voices, you don't have to wait a year and that kind of thing. So if we think of waterfall as this starting at understand, notice that waterfall doesn't even start with problem identification, problem scoping, or research. It just starts with requirements and assumptions. But that's an aside. But basically, you can think of this as a beginning, middle, and end. When you start at what should you make, design it, code it, release it. This is one full cadence, but it doesn't get iterated on. It's linear. It ends, you move on, you do something else. But this, I'm going to call a cadence, or for lack of a better term. What Agile does, and you've been doing this without knowing it maybe, in sprints, is each one of these is kind of like a mini waterfall. Sprint 1 is plan, design, build, test, review, but it's kind of a cadence of going from what to make to designing it, and in a real company, you'd code it and release it. But instead of stopping there and only doing it every year, a sprint's every 2 weeks, every month, every something, and you're basically like combining waterfalls linear, and we're going into a circle. I think in design and products have to be produced by companies. Companies have had linear business models for a while, and now we're going into a circular business model, circular economy. So there's something about circles and iterative loops and learning and improvement that I think really is a trend. And I won't go through all of these, but these are different ways to visualize Agile. And you can look at those at your own discretion. So how do you know if your MVP was successful? So Google uses this framework. So they have goals, signals, and metrics. There's a link there for other measurement frameworks. So happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, and task success. So let's break this down for a second. Why is this used? So the only reason you can know if an MVP produces value is if you measure its success or not. How do you measure that? This is one way. So let's take an example, happiness, a goal. Users find the app helpful, fun, and easy to use. A signal that the goal was achieved. People responding to surveys, people leaving 5-star ratings, leaving positive user feedback. So when we get into a signal, how do we know to what degree that signal is signaling the intensity? A net promoter score, customer satisfaction rating, number of 5-star reviews. So we're going from general to specific. And you can come up with your own. There's other measurement frameworks there. And so the whole idea is, did your minimum viable product succeed? And I would, as a stakeholder, like to hear less. Certain respondents said they would use it in the future, but if you produce something more robust in the future in your jobs, you produce it that works, you're actually able to put something out in the world where you're actually able to get user analytics, user behavior. Behavior speaks louder than words. So that is the simplest, most, if you're gonna adopt a framework, this is a good one to start with. As a stakeholder, I'm wanting to hear, maybe you didn't test your MVP, but how would you test it? Based on your problem statement and your design principles, what are the things you're gonna measure? What are your goals, signals, and metrics? Highly recommend that you all have this in your final presentation. It's gonna make for a lot stronger review. And in phase 4, stakeholders are gonna love you for this. Before I get into questions, there's resources. There's a bunch of extra resources here. So if you go to resources, I provided articles that explain MVPs and then measuring your MVP. And a lot of my examples came from this folder here. So we're 4 minutes over. I can stop now, I can answer questions, or I can give you a case study really quickly about how I didn't follow an MVP at all, and it failed miserably. So all the above are options, and if you don't have office hours with Amy or something happening, I'm happy to go over a little bit. You tell me what you would need or want at this point.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You had your hand up.
No, go first.
In terms of creating the MVP, how important is the content, the writing? I know we've heard different things about using your and some. So just
So in order to produce value, you want to measure how it would be used in the real world. So you'll want to have something as close to possible as real content. And you make assumptions, you make guesses, but at this point, there's less of the user using their imagination and more of them responding to the specific concrete decisions that you've made.
Follow-up question was related to our concept testing, but we kind of tried, I tried both approaches, not providing content, and at that point, the users were like totally lost, and with content, they got really distracted, and it was hard to find a happy medium. In that case, that type of case, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah. So when we talk about hierarchy, visual and textual, we have headers, and HTML has a header structure, H1, H2, H3, and Google Docs we have header structures. You can be really specific on like the main title, main header, and maybe like most text is like actually bars or squiggles. Maybe a word or two here are pulled out. When we talk about building prototypes, when we talk about building MVPs, there's the fidelity or the functionality, and then the resolution or the visuals. And then I would argue that depending on how you use words, it's a visual and or a functionality thing. But you want to only write as much as you need to, and everything else is just a facsimile of text, but not lorem ipsum. Maybe it's like blurred text or something like that. So if you write too much and it's not essential, you can cause opportunities for distraction. And if you write too little, people will be confused. So you're right, there's a happy medium, and there's many ways that I've just described to kind of achieve that balance. Yeah.
So you were saying things that MVP should not be, and that you will give us pushback on, and one of the big ones was we should not be introducing new untested features, but you also said that it was kind of okay if we pivoted on a feature that tested well. So like if we, like for example, we had like a social feature, and that particular social feature did not work well, but we found out that our users wanted some sort of social feature. So if we build that in, but it's not super, that particular feature is not super well tested.
Yeah, so I would say if it's not well tested, don't put it in. If you put it in, you have to have it tested before I see it as a stakeholder. When I said you could kind of pivot or kind of fudge, it's more like getting a pair of pants tailored because you either gained or lost a couple pounds, and you're going like from a 32 to a 31, and not anything more, and the style of pants are still the same. So minor shifts to make it not a Frankenstein, but ultimately at this point, do you have enough time to come with a complete, not completely new feature, but a significantly new feature, and then test it? I don't know if you have time, and if you don't make it new, and it's up to your discretion. It's really, is it a 1 inch change in your waistline or 2 inches? Like in check-ins and stuff, we'll talk about that, but it's a good question, and just make sure you can time box to make sure that by the time I see it, no matter what changes, you have it tested. And arguably, you want to do what's best for the user and iterate, and then modify and add and test, but we only have so much time. Nothing? Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So, real quick, do you want to see the case study? Yeah? Okay. This is like kind of painful because this was my baby for like a good long while. So I read the Lean Startup, and I had no idea what I was doing because I really didn't know what an MVP was or should be, and so I came up with this idea I called flash date. So the whole idea was that if you've ever been on an online dating app, it's just some people take forever to go back and forth to meet up with you, and they're out of town and they whatever, and so the whole idea was like you meet somebody when you're available, and my first version was like you meet them today. So like I'm free after work, like I want to go on a date, that kind of thing. So the problems I identified, takes too long to meet in person, and then I always got annoyed like, where do you want to meet? Where do you live? And it's like okay, let's like solve that. Solution: help busy people reduce the time from matching online to meeting in person by making coordination and planning effortless. My theory was real chemistry happens in the real world, so let's get them off the app as fast as possible. And so I went to Dolores Park. I was in San Francisco at the time, and I had all these prototypes, and I went out and I like did concept testing, talked to about 70 people, got feedback, and so this woman's on the train. She sets her availability for today and like where she's gonna be roughly at that time that's convenient for her. And there's the ability to check her calendar. And so like you can already see I'm like taking this concept where like really the core could have just been like, when are you free? Like that's the MVP. But like I've added check your calendar, I've added your place, and like we're already ballooning the feature set. And then like I have this whole idea of like a flake score, and I'll get into that checking in, and I'm adding all these things, and like, did you stand up them? And then like, she checks her messages, and now they get accepted for a date, and so, it looped into Yelp, so I'm like adding another feature, like goes into an API, and it's like near Sarah, in between near you, and it would like give you, and then I'm adding another feature where it's like if you check in, that helps with the flake score because both people have to check in, and if you check in, like I'm gonna work with the restaurants here and get $5 off. It's like, it's like crazy. It's like ballooning already. And then it tells her that there's a request, and then now there's a time and a place, and now she can change the time or place. And it's like, what's happening? It's so much ballooning. And then there's like a checking in feature, and then like all this stuff, and like they meet, and so the whole idea was like reduce waiting, eliminate scheduling, simplify planning, that kind of thing. And so like that was like my vision, and it was like this. And so what I wasted all this time. I mean, this app is not on the App Store, so clearly like it didn't go anywhere. But like I wasted all this time. Oh, it's gonna show that way. So like. View. So like I designed this whole flow. So when I talked about not designing a whole flow, like I designed a whole flow. Like I should have picked just the matching and time. Like come on, Mo, that was like all you needed to do. So I wasted all this time where I'm like, you know what this needs? It needs like an intro screen. Okay, onboarding. Meet when you're free. Act quickly because the matches get deleted. So it incentivizes you to get off the app. And then you decide where to meet, so I've added a location, and then get perks. I don't know why I did that. And then flake protection. I don't know. I've gotten stood up like maybe once in my entire life. I didn't identify this in my research as a problem. I don't know. And then like some user that I tested with was like, I don't know if I want to join until I see how hot people are on it. So I'm like adding a new feature. It's called Take a Peek, which I actually think is interesting. But like, do I need to do that in my MVP? No. So it's like, David, he's so burly. I like that. So don't worry about it. And then I'm adding a user flow, and then so like creating a user profile. It's not like part of the MVP, and she like writes things, and she puts in her like preferences and more about her. And then her like filters, and then there's all these stuff, and then I'm like, oh okay, and then she matches, and then I gotta create all these things, like there's a countdown timer of how much the matches are, and then like I have like when they were online and people that changed their schedule, and it's like this is ballooning into complexity, and like and then I realized like all these symbols of like, what is a flash date, which is a concept I came up with. So I realized people didn't know what that was. So I have like onboarding. So I'm like, oh my goodness. So the whole idea was like, at any point, you take the awkwardness out of like, you want to meet me? It was just like, I want to meet you. You press a button, and basically what happens is like, if you're in a conversation, and you like what the person is saying, you can press the flash date button, and give me a second here. So basically the person is like, oh, I want to ask this person out. So they can press the flash date button, and then basically it picks a place, the place picker, the person picks a place, and you can only match with people that are free at the same time, so the time's already kind of picked. And the whole idea is once the select location is picked, David gets sent a flash date request, and there's this like, or David asks Sarah out, and there's this like little hand that animates. So I'm adding a micro interaction. It's crazy, too much. And then a flash date request. You tap to respond, and then Sarah wants to meet you, and then you're adding all these things like meet, suggestion, location, all this stuff, and then like there's all these things, right? So I went to a hackathon, and so all I really needed to do when I say polish just the core feature set, what I should have done is this. So like picking when you're free and telling the system when you're free so you can match only with people that are free is the only thing that really matters, and that was my MVP. And so what I should have done is like, what's the best way to like design it? So like here's all these ways that like I designed it, and then it's like, now I'm kind of getting to like, it was the right thing, did I do it the right way? And I went to a hackathon, and this idea actually got a lot of interest, but the whole idea, but the whole idea was that like the person that won, we were like 4th place, the person that won said, we have a business model, and this designed app is a part of the entire solution. We have an MVP, it's been validated. We have problem solution fit, we have market solution fit, like we deserve to win. But their idea wasn't as flashy, it wasn't as big, it wasn't grandiose. But because of that, they won the hackathon, and I'm like, oh crap, I need to start designing with an MVP. I still think there's value in some of the core concepts that I brought up, but Flash Date, actually 2 apps with the same concept got released within a month of me getting 4th place in the hackathon. I don't know if they're being used at all or anything, but I know they became companies and they made some money. And they were able to create an engineering team to create the smallest thing. I had a team of only designers, and we were creating the biggest thing. So it never lived. It's only living in this lecture right now. And then I have this whole story about my personal life, about how making this dating app resulted in some crazy, weird, wacky adventures, and changed how I see myself and dating in the world in a better, healthier way. But that's what I got out of it, a lot of learning, but I didn't produce value for users in the world like I wanted to. So I want you guys to not create your versions of the metaphor of Flash Date. Create something that is like more like the Spotify model, and then you will serve your users sooner. And if you don't serve them, you'll learn why. You'll iterate. You'll create another MVP. Eventually, if you stick at it, you'll help those people out. So there we go.